Bonjour and good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. It's greatly appreciated. And we hope our presentation gives you a lot to chew on. I'm joined by my friends today, Geneviève from Quebec City, Madeline from Vancouver, Julianne from Montreal, and Anna from Halifax. And my name is Petros, and I'm from Edmonton. Today, we'll walk you through our study of food innovation, of a food innovation cluster in Canada's North. And we'll start with some context, a literature review, a summary of what we heard, and a set of recommendations. To get us started, we'll kick things off with a video.
I believe that there is a huge opportunity to support people to solve and work on their food systems issues together.
Just bringing people together from all walks of life that don't often get a chance to meet in the same rooms.
People are getting excited, motivated by what each other is doing in their own community.
Tackling the real issues that are not going to have a one solution. Food and land and culture and climate are intimately connected. So we really can't talk about food security without talking about climate change and how we adapt to that.
The North is suffering from the impacts of climate change in a dramatic fashion, and we need to be having that front of mind when we're looking at innovative ways to improve food security.
I think a cluster of quite a wide-ranging background of organizations and individuals would serve a great purpose in addressing these issues.
I really do believe in collective action, and I believe in the wisdom of the people who are most involved.
Communities leading the way, really, and working in an honest, open, and collaborative way.
And we have an opportune moment here with the Indigenous people of Northern Canada, and we can rectify many things in one go.
Food and food security really is everything about having a healthy population, healthy people, and a healthy planet.
In 2014, the Council of Canadian Academies found that Canada's northern communities were in the midst of a food security crisis. 5 years later, and those words still ring true today. Paradoxically, Canada's North exports nearly $1 billion worth of fresh food, fresh fish, and marine products, while importing hundreds of millions of dollars of food that typically lacks freshness or nutritional value. In recognition of this problem and the challenges that northern communities face globally, the Arctic Council, an intergovernmental forum of Arctic states, is considering the establishment of an Arctic Food Innovation Cluster. The logic being that greater production of food by and for the North could tackle its food security rates and also be a boon to local economic development. The Government of Canada, more specifically Circumpolar Affairs, has expressed interest in this cluster initiative and selected Professor David Natcher from the University of Saskatchewan to further study it. In support of him and this initiative, our task force has conducted a preliminary study of this cluster's feasibility in Northern Canada. In particular, we wanted to understand what are some of the challenges facing the food chain in Canada's North. Could an innovation cluster assist in resolving them? What kind of cluster model would work best within the context of Canada's North? And who are some of the key stakeholders that should be engaged? Our approach consisted of an extensive literature review and, more importantly, 30 informational interviews with stakeholders who are directly involved in Canada's northern food scene or establishing clusters in Canada. And this is in addition to the dozens of stakeholders that we met throughout our study tours across Canada as part of this program.
Donc, lorsqu'on parle de la sécurité alimentaire, on parle d'un concept à 3 dimensions. La première étant la disponibilité des aliments, que ce soit par leur production, leur distribution ou leur échange. Deuxième dimension étant l'accessibilité des aliments. Et la troisième étant l'utilité des aliments. Donc, on parle ici non seulement des valeurs nutritionnelles et de la qualité des aliments, mais également de la pertinence culturelle de ces aliments-là pour un individu ou une collectivité. Donc, ce n'est que lorsque les 3 dimensions sont réunies qu'on peut dire qu'une personne ou une collectivité sont en situation de sécurité alimentaire. Au Canada, l'insécurité alimentaire touche des Canadiens et des Canadiennes de partout au pays, de toute origine ethnique. Au niveau canadien, le taux moyen d'insécurité alimentaire se situe à 12,4 %. Mais ce qu'on constate, c'est que les chiffres démontrent vraiment que les familles inuites et des Premières Nations du Nord canadien sont touchées de façon disproportionnée par l'insécurité alimentaire. On parle d'un taux allant jusqu'à 46,8 % au Nunavut. Et l'un des principaux facteurs qui explique cette crise, c'est la dépendance accrue aux aliments produits au sud et importés à grands coûts dans les communautés nordiques, en raison notamment de la difficulté qui est vécue par les Inuits et les membres des Premières Nations dans le Nord canadien de maintenir un mode de vie traditionnel. La principale initiative qui a été mise en place par le gouvernement fédéral pour résoudre cette crise, c'est le programme Nutrition Nord Canada. C'est un programme de subvention qui subventionne l'importation et la vente de denrées périssables dans les communautés nordiques. Et comme vous le savez sans doute, le programme a fait l'objet de nombreuses critiques en raison de son succès mitigé. C'est pourquoi plusieurs sont à la recherche de solutions alternatives pour solutionner la crise alimentaire dans le Nord canadien, notamment par le développement d'une industrie de production alimentaire dans le Nord même. Et l'un des modèles de développement économique qui est discuté, c'est celui de la grappe d'innovation. En anglais, on parle de Innovation Cluster. Et l'idée derrière ce modèle-là, c'est de favoriser l'établissement de relations entre divers acteurs économiques dans un secteur et souvent dans une région donnée, afin de créer une synergie qui permettrait le développement économique de ce secteur-là ou de cette région. Notre équipe s'est également intéressée à au modèle d'entreprise sociale comme véhicule de développement économique. Une entreprise sociale, c'est une entreprise qui est ancrée dans la communauté et qui travaille à l'atteinte d'un but à caractère soit social, culturel ou environnemental par le biais de la vente de biens ou de services. Donc, notre rapport explore la possibilité d'établir un modèle hybride de grappe d'innovation à caractère social dans le Nord canadien.
So building on these elements, we went into our stakeholder consultations. And during these consultations, there were these 3 phrases that kept coming up again and again. And these phrases were, it just comes down to money. There's something about this place. And without the people, you won't have success. And these 3 words, money, people, place, came to define so many of the challenges that we heard affect Canada's Arctic. So first, money. There were 2 different types of financing that our respondents spoke to. The first is the generous public financing that they felt was largely available. However, this type of financing, made available by the federal government largely, took a long time to process. It conflicted with traditional harvesting schedules, and it had a heavy administrative burden that most communities were simply ill-equipped to respond to. By comparison, private financing was largely impossible to access. The high risk and low yield investment opportunity posed by these areas was found to be broadly unappealing to traditional lending bodies. And even where money was available, respondents told us that communities simply didn't have the human capacity to process these funds. And that brings us to people. In the area of people, our respondents had so much to say. Canada's Arctic has a really small population that's spread across an enormous geographic area, and the shortages of manpower have resulted in high salaries that really have eaten into the already tight profit margins, and this further disincentivizes a culture and a climate of innovation. And yet, it's very interesting, these communities face a really interesting, what we came to term the ownership paradox. On one hand, we hear these challenges of the north and the urbanization and the population being spread across this area. And on the other hand, we hear about the absolute necessity that food security solutions are community-led and locally based. So against this backdrop, a food-based social enterprise model where employees are owners and they benefit not only from economic incentives, but also from enhanced food security training and a culturally appropriate schedule and enhanced social capital, seemed pretty promising to us. And lastly, there are a series of geographic limitations that are specific just to Canada's north. So for example, people noted that the challenges with transportation, infrastructure, distribution are very challenging in this context. One producer even told us that the costs of transportation outweigh his costs of production. So we see these challenges, and yet we see also there's a lot of regional nuances. So not every area of the Arctic is faced with the same challenges. And yet these three words, money, people, and place, we heard a fourth word come up a lot, potential.
Oui, en effet, du potentiel, il y en a. Malgré les défis de taille dont on vient de parler, il y a des atouts indéniables dans le Nord pour concevoir une grappe d'innovation pour lutter contre l'insécurité alimentaire. Il existe en effet une très grande richesse, une richesse humaine au niveau des liens entre les habitants. Un sentiment communautaire qui est fort, une détermination à vivre dans le Nord, de la résilience, une motivation, une fierté, tous les ingrédients qu'il faut pour cimenter la confiance et monter des projets dans des communautés à taille humaine. Ces projets sont axés sur le capital social, dans le but de stimuler le développement économique, mais ils doivent aussi respecter des principes de pratiques autochtones et des volontés de réconciliation. Il faut aussi mettre de l'avant les connaissances locales spécialisées que les autochtones et les résidents du Nord sont les seuls à détenir. Des connaissances qu'il nous faut collectivement préserver, mettre de l'avant et sur lesquelles on doit s'appuyer pour adapter la filière alimentaire dans le Nord, qui est très affectée, on l'a dit, par les changements climatiques. On peut imaginer une multitude d'appellations d'origine contrôlée qui pourraient reconnaître ces connaissances. L'expérience pertinente de certaines collectivités du Nord en production, commercialisation, vente de produits alimentaires ou de pratiques artistiques traditionnelles sont aussi des avantages très précieux. On peut penser à la multitude d'échanges d'expériences, de mentorat d'expertise qui pourraient se créer au sein d'une grappe. Il ne faut pas non plus négliger les relations existantes entre les entreprises du Nord et les partenaires gouvernementaux dans la gestion des fonds et des subventions. Ça reste à améliorer et il faut s'appuyer sur la réalité de ces entreprises-là pour améliorer nos processus. Enfin, toutes les personnes à qui nous avons parlé ont reconnu qu'il existe dans le Sud et à l'étranger un marché inexploité pour les produits du Nord. On connaît les aliments canadiens comme des aliments sûrs, fiables et de bonne qualité, comme nous l'a dit Jennifer Miller, directrice générale responsable de l'initiative des super grappes d'innovation. Mais le Nord apporte une super marque, avec des aliments originaux, durables, propres et sûrs. Et pour les grappes, il faut des marques fortes et reconnaissables qui attirent argent, clients et partenaires.
Given this potential, in light of the challenges, we nevertheless concluded that a supercluster, an Arctic Food Innovation Cluster, could be an effective solution for addressing food security in Canada's North. Yes, the North lacks many of the traditional drivers for a cluster, for example, a concentrated skilled labor market pool. However, we believe that these social factors would be sufficient for a successful cluster to take off. In addition, we believe that a cluster and its leveraging of collective action would provide an elegant solution to many of the problems raised by our interviewees. For example, financing issues centralized through a cluster could address and make financing more regionally appropriate. To move this project forward, we have three primary recommendations. First, we recommend that the cluster consider social enterprise as a theme. We believe that traditional economic factors are contribute to the current food insecurity situation in the North as it is, and that without concerted effort that this investment reinvests in the community, food insecurity may not be addressed by this initiative. Second, we believe that this cluster should consider expansion beyond strictly food stakeholders. During our interviews, we heard that many food producers are already working with other industry members who face similar problems. For example, transportation is a problem across industries in the North. And therefore, we believe building on these linkages makes the most sense in order to ensure success. Third, this project needs a driver. We believe that in order to move this initiative forward, immediately a CEO or a project manager or an intern position needs to be created, a person to begin to amass the social capital and linkages required to make this project take off. In our report, we enumerate several activities for this driver to take, but I'm going to highlight two for you right now. First, we believe that immediately a plan for deeper local consultation is required, specifically with Indigenous communities, something that we were not able to exhaustively do in our research. Second, we believe that the public sector and private sector buy-in for this work that we began needs to be reaffirmed. And with that, I thank you all very much for taking the time to listen to us, and we look forward to your questions.
And we're turning to our panelists again for the first questions. dire, je vais rester avec la politique établie par Hélène. Comme je les ai torturés pendant 10 mois, je vais laisser d'autres l'opportunité de le faire.
So I'll go first since I didn't put a question to the last group. So I know that it's difficult, given the limited opportunities that you had to meet in particular with people in the north. But I'm really interested in the fact that your last slide, it's still up there, says recommendations for the federal government. And the previous group also had recommendations for the federal government, but there were also calls for working with federal and provincial and territorial governments and working with industry. So maybe you could speak a little bit to the fact that your recommendations are devoted really just to, it seems, one stakeholder, when you've talked so much about the need to ensure that Indigenous interests are taken into account, that there are issues around geography and people. Why just direct your recommendations to one actor?
I think it's worth noting the context of our report a little bit, given the current federal government's initiatives in this area to establish existing clusters which have already begun. And the impetus, as was mentioned for this research, was actually a federal government query, essentially, to the Arctic Circumpolar Council. And so that's where we believe, so in our third recommendation where we suggest this driver, implicit, I guess, is that we believe the federal government will be the one, if there's still this interest, to appoint that driver. So I think that's why they are such a focus. But no doubt, definitely buy-in from other levels of government. As we've seen in the establishment of the other innovation clusters across Canada, the purpose of that driver is then to bring together those other stakeholder groups, so be it territorial governments, academic institutions, civil society, industry, etc.
Something else worth noting is that in our interviews, we've heard of actually other initiatives that kind of had a similar purpose of trying to connect folks in the community, entrepreneurs, financiers together. But where things kind of fall apart is that you're not having someone actually following through and kind of having that consistency in place. And I think, of all the different kind of organizations out there, the federal government is well suited to do that, to play that consistent driver in ensuring that conversations, connections are taking place.
Maybe I'll go next. So I have a sort of a big picture question for you that I think people sometimes get quite passionate about. And I'll ask it in the form of inviting you to respond to a very brief story, which is this. So in 1971, Alan Blakeney was in Uranium City, northern Saskatchewan, campaigning to be premier, and he was speaking to a completely silent room of uranium miners. And when he paused for breath, one of the biggest guys in the back of the hall yelled at him, "What about the beer?" And so there was that moment you see quite often in Ottawa these days, which was a brief moment of consternation at the head table in a consultation. And once Alan figured out what this question was about, which was the miners wanted to know why beer in northern Saskatchewan cost 4 times more than in southern Saskatchewan. And so he said, and I won't do my Alan imitation, but basically what he said is, I hereby commit that if I'm elected premier, every citizen of Saskatchewan will pay the same amount for beer. And they all went, yay! And he won all the seats in that part of the province and went on to be a very successful premier. Now here's my question. So what Mr. Blakeney was asserting there was the right to beer. And that wasn't a small decision, because it was a very significant logistics consequence. The province had to build a very big warehouse and transportation network in northern Saskatchewan to deliver all that beer. And the cost was socialized in the rest of the province so that everybody could have the same amount. Now you can comment on the right to beer if you like to, but what I'm asking you basically is there a right to food? In other words, is the principle that Mr. Blakeney accepted, which is that everyone has the right to roughly the comparable costs on beer, also apply to food. And if so, have you not begged the question of should Canada somehow socialize the costs of the very significant, as you've encountered in your studies, the very significant logistics and transport and food production costs to equalize the cost of food between what is a quite low income area in Canada and the rest of the country? Or are you saying that's not a principle that you support and essentially you're proposing, you know, some ingenious method for people in northern Canada to deal with the fact that their geography, the logistics, the costs confront them with costs of food that are 2, 3, 4 times more than other citizens? In other words, what's your comment on the big question you raise here, which is the grotesque difference in the cost of food in the north versus the south? And what are people's rights here to begin with?
I'll try to address this question. The first thing I want to mention is that this is outside the scope of what our mandate was, so my answer is probably going to go to a tangent that we didn't really explore that much, but I'll take a stab at answering that question. First of all, you're asking if there's a right to food, a right to beer. I'm interested in the right to wine, personally, but in terms of a right to food, I think, so in Canada, there's no right to food in the Human Rights Act. It's not something that's constitutionalized, but I would say that at the international level, it is. There's a recognition of the right to food, the right to housing, and these have not yet been important in Canadian law, but there's certainly a discussion that has been going on, especially in terms of the right to housing, that's been going on in Canada, and I wouldn't be surprised to see the right to food as being something that will be addressed eventually as an issue in Canada. Now you're talking about the socialization of the food and how, as a collectivity, we can ensure that everybody has the same access to food. And that's where I'm going to a tangent. As part of this program, we have written op-eds, and my op-ed was about comparing the Canadian approach with the Greenland approach to food security. And the fellows are going to be familiar with this concept because I mentioned that I did go to Greenland, and I was shocked to see that I could go to a grocery store that really looks like a French or an Italian or Danish grocery store where I can buy very fancy chocolate, very fancy wine, cheese, and all that stuff for about the same price as I would in Europe. And I was struck by this because I had just spent 4 days in Iqaluit where I could only purchase frozen food from the freezer, low quality, low nutrition, for like $25 for 2 pogos, for example. So to me it was very striking that 2 regions with the same geography, the same climate, and the same heritage in terms of being populated by Inuit, people of Inuit descent, would be so different. And so my op-ed was about this, and what I found out is that in Greenland they have nationalized the food distribution system. So they have one big company that is being managed by Greenland, the government of Greenland, and that company includes grocery stores, a distribution company, a gas company, and so this company is basically like a one-stop shop where they ensure that the food can be distributed at a low price in all the regions of Greenland. So whether you're in Nuuk, which is the capital, or little outpost where there's only 200 inhabitants living on the ice sheet, you find the same products at the same price because they've been able, by nationalizing the food distribution system, to make the prices affordable for all Greenland inhabitants of Greenland. So there are, I guess my point is that there are some models out there that we can look at, models where the whole of society would contribute to equalizing the access to food for people that live in the north. We know that it's important for us to recognize that these people live in the north. It's important for Canada because of the sovereignty in the Arctic, but it's also important because the Inuit people, that's where they come from. That's where they choose to live. That's where their land is. And so I think it's important to recognize that in our society there is a duty for all of us to contribute to the success and the well-being of people living up north. So that would be my answer to that.
Peut-être pour ajouter sur cette question que je trouve extrêmement intéressante du droit, toutes les personnes qu'on a rencontrées, puis on a participé à différents panels aussi pendant la table des idées, l'assemblée annuelle du réseau alimentaire pour une alimentation durable à Montréal, et des panels et des personnes qui représentaient différentes communautés autochtones. Puis souvent la question se posait de la résilience. Et puis ils nous ont un petit peu ramené aussi à des concepts d'humilité, de se dire qu'il n'y en avait pas beaucoup de problèmes de résilience alimentaire il y a quelques générations. Et que les effets aussi des changements alimentaires qui ont été imposés ont des effets dévastateurs. Donc l'approche qu'on a aussi à travers l'entrepreneuriat social, c'est d'avoir une approche plus holistique qui prend en compte de quelle nourriture est-ce qu'on parle culturellement acceptable. Comment est-ce qu'on peut redonner aussi la capacité de chasser, de pêcher, parce que là aussi il y a les questions pas simplement de nourriture, mais la question de pouvoir pratiquer des pratiques ancestrales, la question du territoire aussi, the right to land. Donc c'est une approche aussi beaucoup plus large qu'il faut avoir. Et puis je pense qu'on a beaucoup appris aussi de cette démarche de pas avoir de quelle nourriture est-ce qu'on parle, de pouvoir aussi changer le narratif par rapport à ça. Voilà.
Je vais poser la prochaine question. Je vais vous poser une question de leadership. Je comprends que c'est une initiative qui a été amorcée par un intérêt du gouvernement fédéral. Les recommandations sont fondées dans le gouvernement fédéral dans cette dynamique-là. Je trouve le concept de structure super intéressant parce que, effectivement, ça apporterait une belle approche incluant l'élément social dans l'approche de l'accessibilité pour les aliments. Par contre, ce qui m'inquiète, c'est que historiquement, les initiatives qui ont été amorcées par le gouvernement, par le gouvernement fédéral ou territorial, provinciaux, le succès est souvent mitigé à cause que la contrepartie du leadership local qui est absent ou qui n'est pas bien nourri ou découvert. Alors, quelles sont vos observations? Vous avez quand même eu la chance de rencontrer et de discuter avec plusieurs personnes. Je sais que vous faites une recommandation d'avoir un CEO qui serait le porte-parole, l'encourageur du projet, mais ça ne m'explique pas quel aspect du leadership qui va être développé de façon locale. Il me manque cet élément-là dans les propositions que je viens de faire. Alors, je me demandais si c'était quoi vos observations, est-ce que vous avez discuté de cette question-là et quels sont les résultats de discussion?
So we certainly, yes. Misspent federal government funds, that's never a problem. Didn't think of it. No, just kidding. We did. And obviously that's a concern. I think that's what's unique and interesting about the Supercluster Initiative. I mean, we would wish in a perfect world that we could see the outcome of the clusters that are currently working towards this type of thing, but I think the beauty in these solutions is that they attempt to, they may be sort of given a sprout by the federal government in the form of financing, but the idea is that then the community takes ownership, and that's really the strength that we believe. That's really the one strength that we honed in on the most in the North, is that we believe that community, if given that opportunity, we saw in the dialogues and the conversations that we had a sort of independent spirit and remarkably high social capital between stakeholders in the North, because they are in such a unique, difficult situation that requires a lot of resilience. That were they given the tools, they often they demonstrated sort of an entrepreneurial initiative that they did believe in their own capacity to come together. I think that we also heard about a number of organizations in the North and in different places that sounded kind of similar, where they brought together stakeholders to discuss problems, but many of those organizations didn't have a serious backbone of funding. So there's familiarity with working together, but there's never been the infusion financing, I think, required to really give it a chance.
More questions from the, yep.
So thank you very much, Pam. It was a very interesting and informative presentation. Again, I'll go back to my Cartesian split between form and substance. I have to say the form was beautiful. The video, the document is very compelling from a visual point of view, and the message is partly the message, but it's partly the delivery, and your delivery was very effective. So on the form, félicitations. As I put down, it whets your appetite for more. So just follow through that pun. So on the substance side, the one question I have for you is, I think you are a group that's thinking outside the box, and that you're not willing to be bound by traditional food and agriculture analysis, which I think is very, very good, and it really gets the creative juices flowing. My question to you, though, is how do you stop this project from becoming too big, too unmanageable, socially and geographically speaking? It's a big place. The differences from the Yukon to Nunavut are quite striking from your report about the sophistication of agricultural enterprises. And socially, while you say, I like the social enterprise cluster goes beyond food security, goes to things like transportation and entrepreneurship and social enterprise. How do you stop that from becoming so diffuse that you lose your focus?
Thank you for the question, Don. In our report, we actually enumerate seven areas that we believe that who have this driver, this position that's created, should focus in on. One of them is narrowing scope. One problem in particular that we noted fairly early on is that we had sort of a definition of the North that was very broad. It was given to us like, this is the area that we'd like to look at, and we just believe it's too broad. It's very diverse. It's sort of like it makes every challenge that we uncovered in the North, it blows it up even bigger. So that's, I think, one of the first initiatives would be to narrow the scope in terms of geography and which stakeholders. So we suggest social enterprise as a theme, so food and social enterprise, but then we also evidently recommended you might want to include other stakeholders. So delimiting where the inclusions are is, I think, an important next step.
I can tell my colleagues are getting nervous that I've been so quiet for so long, which for those who know me is very unusual. So to help relax them, I think I'll add in that I'm not sure that this is a concern that we really need to worry that much about. The population is very small. There is historically, of course, a significant distrust with the federal government, and that will necessarily reduce some communities that are interested in participating in this kind of venture. I think also when we look at the capacity for innovation in many of these communities, they are simply so busy trying to survive. There is just not an enormous number of prospective innovators, just sitting and waiting for the announcement of a federal cluster. So with respect, I think it's, it may not be the storm in the teapot or the tempest in the teapots that it would be if this was a discussion about a cluster, an innovation cluster in the South, which historically, as you know, we've seen, the appetite from industry, from voluntary sector, et cetera. There's a huge energy and momentum around. I don't think we'll see that off the bat, at least initially in the North.
Thank you. I would like to give the audience now an opportunity to ask questions. I'll come around.
Hi, my name is Sharon Leslie. I'm with the Dean's Council, Agriculture, Food and Veterinary Medicine. Actually, I worked in James Bay. Well, when I lived there, you would buy just a limp rag, and you'd look at the food and you go, well, it's kind of good, so I'll buy it anyway. It's really expensive. But a lot of the people didn't know what to do with a lot of the fresh food, and that was only in James Bay, which didn't have a road. So I think along with getting the food there, you have to show people how to use it, how to cook, why it would be good for them. I remember a story about someone never having peas before, and these funny little things just kept rolling off the plate. So how do you do that?
That's I would say that's a juicy question, but I need a vegetable equivalent for that. My puns aren't as advanced as Petra says. I think for me, the production of vegetables in the north is particularly such a miss. You know, the shelf stability of them means that they're some of the hardest products for communities in communities in the north to access. We had a very interesting conversation with a gentleman who Wade runs the Iqaluit food, it was a food bank essentially in Iqaluit, but it was so much more than this. And this speaks, I think, to the plurality of skills that exist in northern communities. So there was a single individual who was both running the food bank, he was running traditional seminars on how to prepare food in a traditional way with not always the most traditional ingredients. He was talking about nutrition and diet. He became kind of an informal dietitian and was really playing this extraordinarily broad role in the community. And it was one of the conversations, I think, that for us really sparked the idea or seeded the idea of this kind of cluster, because imagine if you were able to unlock the potential not only of a single individual, but you were able to grow that individual's capacity, you were able to inject it with mentorship potentially from other parts of the country, with funding, with expertise, and most importantly, you were able to relieve some of those challenges around transportation that occupy so much of his time and day-to-day, transportation and financing. We heard again and again that these are the two biggest challenges that were occupying the majority of this kind of individual's time. So for us, it's a really nice holistic way of addressing those and opening the time for the reintroduction of traditional foods, the reintroduction of, of some of these, more traditional diets that are healthier and so much better for the environment and for people.
I would just add to what Maddie said, that one of the dimensions of food security, as we discussed before, was that the food should be culturally appropriate to the population that has access to that food. And so our vision for this innovation cluster is that what is being produced in the north should be led, like those decisions should be led by the community, and they should decide for themselves what they want to eat, what is culturally appropriate for them to grow and eat. And so that definitely is one of the elements that the drivers and the stakeholders that would be part of this cluster should look at.
And it's worth noting that inclusivity is the best medicine for blind spots, at least when it comes to policy. And that's why that our cluster focus, so much of it is more than the traditional cluster of just having industry and, let's say, academic institutions being a core part of its membership. A big part of this as well is having community organizations as well in helping deliberate some of these solutions and being a part of this broader policy solution in resolving food security in the north. And I think with the programs that Wade runs and whatnot, and teaching how to transferring the knowledge of how to prepare and cook traditional foods, that stuff we're looking at and investigating within the greater context of a food innovation cluster that's well suited for the north as well.
More questions from the audience? I do have a Slido question for you. What advice would you give to the Government of Canada in constructing its social finance fund to ensure the cluster could benefit from it? Very specific.
I would say that's somewhat out of scope for us. I think there's an interesting intersection between the work that we propose and that specific issue, but I don't know that I have much more to offer.
Je pense qu'on peut quand même dire des choses peut-être plus techniques sur l'accessibilité au fond. On a entendu beaucoup de frustrations qui sont reliées à la capacité des communautés dans le Nord de pouvoir, ne serait-ce que rédiger des demandes, faire des rapports. La structure même des programmes parfois est une barrière, une contrainte insoutenable. Il y a vraiment des enjeux de capacité, de disponibilité des ressources humaines. Donc ça nous oblige, nous, à revoir l'ensemble des partenaires publics aussi de revoir leur processus. Les contraintes qu'on impose, la durée aussi des programmes qui parfois est trop courte, qui ne permet pas de voir dans le long terme, peut-être avoir plus de confiance dans financer des opérations plutôt que financer des projets à court terme avec des impacts très étroits. Je pense que ça serait des bons conseils.
As a challenge by financing they felt was available and you know, that it was out there. Particularly, they cited the Canadian Agricultural Partnership as a great source of funding, and they really appreciated that feedback that we gave to Agriculture, Agri-Foods Canada. But you know, all of the themes that Julien spoke to really restricted the utility of this type of funding for the communities. So.
Well, with that, task force number 2. And we will break now for 10 minutes.